Well, thanks for joining our Zoom webinar, hosted by myself, with founder and owner of Pioneer Capital Advisory, Chris Barrett with Midwest CPA, and then Eric Sue with Clear Focus Law. We are going to be talking about specifically what you as a business buyer should be doing pre-acquisition and pre-LOI to best prepare for a due diligence process, and essentially trying to save money on the front end so that you're waiting to engage advisors at the appropriate time. So, just to kind of start here with an outline of what we're going to cover, we're first going to talk about how you as a business buyer can save on costs involved in the diligence process, and thinking about kind of how to do this in the most kind of specific way possible, and really being able to answer before signing an LOI what you should go through. And so at the very end of the process, or the very end of this afterwards, we're going to share checklists of different things that you should do to basically kind of step by step, walk through things like working capital analysis, anything pre-LOI that's fundamentally important to cover. And so just kind of background first here on the three of us. So myself, I'm the founder and owner of Pioneer Capital Advisory. We're focused primarily on SBA financing here. More recently, we've also started non-SBA financing. And basically what we do is it's myself and a team of 8 other people. So my chief operating officer, Valerie, we have 3 sales business development personnel that are focused on the relationship management side of things, 2 financial analysts, 1 guy that runs our independent sponsor vertical, and then a lady that oversees the process from the start of underwriting through to closing. We have worked on over 140 closed deals in the last 4 years. I think that number is close to 150 as of the time of this presentation. And then we have also closed over 300 million of SBA deals in total. Basically anything ranging from e-commerce to roofing, the classic trade businesses, lots of kind of niche type firms too, so like SaaS companies and things across the board. And Eric and Chris, I'll let you guys give a quick background yourselves.
All right, thank you, Matthias. I'm Eric Shu, managing and founding attorney of Clear Focus Law. As the slide indicates, I'm 100% buy side, so I represent buyers all day long. A large part of my buyers are ETA folks, probably 90+%. I've done a lot of deals over the last 4 years when I've been buy side only, representing buyers throughout the entire life cycle of deals, about 160 closed deals or so. I focus on deals between 500,000 and 14 million, lots of them SBA, so work closely with folks like Matthias when we do that, but also a lot of SBA plus private placement plus pari passu. So deals that get larger. And as I mentioned, I help in the entire deal life cycle more and more, especially this year. I find myself helping in the pre-LOI stage where I'm helping buyers make smart decisions. Really what we're focusing on today, how to make smart decisions prior to and as you're putting together the LOI. And then, like I say, the entire life cycle of the deal is what I work on after that. So legal diligence, negotiating and drafting agreements, and helping people get to the closing table.
Awesome. Thanks, Eric. Chris, would you want to go next?
Yeah. Thanks everybody for joining. So my name is Chris Barrett. I'm a CPA. I own and manage Midwest CPA. We're a firm that's specialized in working in the ETA space. Since I launched the firm about 4 years ago, we've grown now to a team of 18. We've worked on over 300 QV engagements. And we assist with clients in that diligence process pre-acquisition. And then a lot of clients, if they do successfully close on their deal, they need ongoing support post-close. So we act as their outsourced accounting department, help them with tax and tax planning. And looking forward to chat with everyone today.
Awesome. So the kind of first slide or kind of topic of information I want to cover is just kind of talking through our team at Pioneer and what we bring to the table on a deal with SBA financing and also non-SBA as well. So we're a small but nimble team. We've been around for just over 4 years. So we started back in May of 2022. And so it's myself, my chief operating officer, Valerie Sash. Valerie and myself have both been in the SBA industry for about 11 years in total. Prior background working at SBA banks. 3 business development team members, Raphael, Andrew, and Mario. So they basically take the call from the point of client prospect outreach and are kind of involved in the onboarding engagement process. And then on the non-SBA side, we also help on independent sponsor transactions. So basically, if you're looking to buy a business that's too large to get done with an SBA loan, let's say the company is doing $2 million of earnings or above, or the debt check need is north of $8 million. That's an area that more recently we've started working with. And then kept pivoting back to the SBA team, we have Fernanda, who's our financial analyst team lead, Humberto, who works under Fernanda or kind of alongside her, and then Maggie, who basically oversees the process from the time underwriting starts through to closing. And so on the SBA side, we're effectively free to work with because we only get paid by the bank after closing. So there's no costs borne by you as the buyer at any point in time in the process. So moving on here to the next slide, this is kind of an outline of what we're going to cover. We're going to start with the content and then end kind of the very end of this with a live Q&A. So we're going to first cover why pre-LOI due diligence is important and where money leaks kind of along the way. Then I'm going to speak on the lender side of things and how these different SBA banks are looking at deals in the current environment. Things like DSCR, is your personal financial statement or your deal bankable? Eric is going to cover the legal side of things, and then we're going to shift to Chris, who's going to take over financial due diligence. And then we're just going to close out kind of with some walkaway points towards the very end. So kind of kicking things off here, one of the things that I've typically seen is that buyers that are going through this for the first time do not really know at what point it makes sense to engage legal or financial due diligence. And you get into the whole kind of balancing act of trying to decide when you're going to basically pull out your wallet or credit card and start spending money, and what items specifically you should be vetting to get comfortable enough to move to the LOI process versus which things should you do post LOI. Because at the end of the day, you want your LOI to be one that you feel good moving forward with. And if terms and conditions ultimately change from what you sign with the seller, it can add friction kind of further along. And so basically, one thing that I've seen is lots of buyers really get married to a deal early on the process. And so like they've been searching for 3 months, 6 months, however long, and they get very emotionally involved in a deal that they want to pursue. And so sometimes what ultimately ends up happening is if that deal is not financeable and or if there's a wrinkle involved in it that comes up further along, they can be very far into it from both the time and a cost standpoint. Other things that can come up in the mix is you find out, so kind of item number 3 here, the seller's numbers and or just the story behind the business is not really what it was presented to be. And so this could be kind of anything in general. The seller being too involved in the business, not really figuring that out pre-LOI, and or the financials that you're given. If you're working with P&L statements or income statements rather than tax returns, you sign the LOI, get the tax returns, the numbers are substantially different, and then the deal ultimately isn't bankable. And so basically, if you go through specific things and kind of do a quick sanity check on the deal and have a checklist of items, it's possible to save time and pain kind of further along in the process. And so takeaway point here is that just shipping an LOI off before doing initial exercises or checking specific things is not always the most pragmatic thing to do. So the first point I want to cover here is that doing more diligence pre-LOI is not always the answer. You want to do specific things such as screening the deal cheaply before you engage folks like Chris or Eric. Basically, you also want to do a lender call before your exclusivity burns out. And then you want to check through the key add backs, not the whole P&L statement, so that you can see if there are specific things that you need to validate to make the numbers ultimately work. It's going to be possible. And so you want to wait to engage folks like Chris's team until you know that the deal is ultimately going to justify the cost, because QVs, unfortunately, even with friends like Chris, are not always cheap to get done. So 4 questions that you really want to ask yourself as a buyer and be able to answer before submitting the LOI is thinking about if the deal is ultimately going to be financeable. And so if the deal, if you're trying to get SBA financing for a deal, and basically let's say the add backs aren't going to hold weight, there's going to be a huge working capital need, the seller's not willing to leave working capital in the business of the amount that's ultimately needed, and or the seller's super involved, there's no org chart to the company, and the seller's really the focal point of revenue or sales coming in the door. Something like that from an SBA lending standpoint in the current time is just going to make the deal just not lendable at all. Chris, or sorry, Eric, on the legal lens, if you'd want to just give a couple of points here on number 2 from your perspective.
Sure, absolutely. And so a lot of times when deals are going to die because of a legal issue, some legal landmine comes up and things grind to a halt. It's not that it wasn't visible pre-LOI when it's cheap. It's that it wasn't spotted. So the right questions weren't being asked. Sometimes if you ask the right question and you don't get an answer, that is an answer by itself. And so that, as Matthias pointed out, the cheapest and easiest time to address legal things that are going to come up no matter what is pre-LOI. Pre-LOI is when it's free to do these things. The further you go into the deal, the more you've engaged legal, especially. And I usually don't recommend engaging legal until someone has cleared financing and someone has cleared finances, so that the deal isn't going to die in the numbers. The more you go into the deal, and we're fixing legal things when the deal is running and diligence folks are already being paid, that's when decisions are expensive. So we'll talk more about how to find those things and what questions to ask, but legal things usually are never a surprise.
Appreciate it, Eric. Chris, do you want to take the earnings quality add backs and working capital normalization with through?
Yeah. And so the thing you can do pre-LOI, the thing of pre-LOI when you're talking about analyzing the financials is that usually you don't get that much information, unfortunately, pre-LOI. You're going to get maybe a SIM that might have some annual numbers. Maybe you're lucky enough to get monthly. Maybe you'll have tax returns, but you're usually not getting like access to their full accounting file, their full customer list, their full vendor list, and all that until you're actually under LOI on that deal. So you are flying a little bit blind, but I do think that there's some checks that you should be doing pre-LOI on the financials side to at least get a gut check of whether what the seller and the broker are telling you are within the realm of reason. The first thing is by knowing an industry is really important, and we'll dig into this a little bit more. But if they're saying their EBITDA multiple on an HVAC company is 45%, well, you know that something has to be wrong, and it's worth digging into to see what it is that's driving them to be incorrect. So you do want to look for those high level gut checks on their financials to see if they're legitimate and if it's actually possible. And the other big one, I'd say the biggest deal killer we run into, as mentioned there, is working capital. You're probably not going to have enough information to peg the working capital exactly pre-LOI, but you should still have a clearly defined definition for how you are going to calculate it. And you should make sure that you at least have the conversation with the seller that gets you in the same ballpark and that with them on the working capital piece, because I've seen it where people kick that conversation way too far into diligence. And by the time they start having that conversation, it results in a big adjustment of purchase price that the seller is not able to swallow, and the deal ends up dying and you're out a lot of money.
And one key thing there too is also just to know, is a seller ultimately going to be willing to include any working capital in the business? Because if they're not, which sometimes happens, unfortunately, sorry, my camera just disappeared. If they're not willing to include working capital, you're gonna have to get from the bank. You're gonna have to self-supply it, and the bigger that number is, it makes things challenging to get done. So last point here, just kind of takeaways on this slide, is the more you can tee a deal up for success pre-LOI, whether it's knowing things like the licenses, specific licenses are going to be required, who's going to be the qualifier, what's the state going to allow versus what will a bank want to approve, and then things like add backs, what are the add backs, how involved they are, working capital normalization. Those will ultimately all help set the deal up for success further along once you're post LOI. So, moving to the next slide here, we're going to talk about various things before. Sorry, Eric, you're going to take this slide. We were talking earlier.
Yes, thank you, Matthias. So 2026 has been a tough market. I've been working with a lot of buyers, and a lot of them have expressed frustration at the market. A lot of gatekeeping by brokers, a lot of high multiples they're having to compete with. And so I've been making a lot of calls with brokers to see how buyers can do a better job. And so this is some of the feedback I'm getting. And it is that buyers need to start thinking like it's an employment, like a job posting that they're responding to. So they needed to make some effort to sell themselves to the seller, more so than probably that I've seen in the last 3 years. Sellers have lots and lots of buyers coming out of the woodwork on every good deal that's being posted. And so a critical key initial threshold is for buyers to sell yourself to the seller first. And we've talked a lot about questions to ask brokers, questions to ask sellers. And one thing I need to emphasize is that a lot of the feedback I'm getting from brokers is that if buyers aren't at least selling themselves first before asking those questions, they're either going to get the cold shoulder, get ignored, or just getting put in the lukewarm pile. And that's nothing that you want as a buyer. So really the things you need to do before you start asking questions in order to prep yourself for an LOI is express to the seller and the seller team that you got a genuine interest in the target and the industry. Again, let's go back to the employment offer, or sorry, the job application analogy. If you just make a generic application because you need a job, you're probably not going to get the time of day. Same thing with sellers. You need to demonstrate that you can operate the business. Sellers still do really care that their business, their baby, isn't going to be run into the ground, burned down by the next owner. So show that you can operate the business. It could be credentials from your W-2. It could be credentials from your side hustle. But one way or the other, don't just say, go look at my LinkedIn. I've got a lot of credentials from my job. I can run your business. Narrate it and show them that you can do it. And then have proof of cash and financing. The bottom line, especially with a broker whose number one goal is eventually to sell the business, because they're not going to get paid a dollar unless they do, is do you have the money and can you get the deal done quick? So have proof of cash, have proof that you've talked to someone like Matthias, and that you've got someone who's reviewed things and can stand behind you from a financing perspective, especially if you need debt financing. And then demonstrate that you're ready to move and to move fast. Demonstrate that you've done your homework. You're not going to be like reading buy then build after you're under LOI. Bad recommendation. Know what that says and what you're going to need, who you're going to need on your deal team. Ideally, do some meet and greets with folks so you already know who you want to talk to, and who you want on your deal team. For example, I offer 15-minute free calls with searchers just to chat. I'm not trying to sell my services. I just want to share with you what I do and what I'm seeing in the industry. Take advantage of that. And I think I believe Chris and Matthias both do that as well. But lots of folks in the ETA world will sit down with you and do a call so that you can learn swim lanes, who you want on your team, why you want them on your team, and then you can show that you're ready to do the work. So this is my the point of this slide and the point of this section is just to encourage you that if you're going to want to move forward with the deal, you're going to want to ask questions of the deal team from the sell side. Make sure you sell yourself first.
And one more comment to add in here too is one thing I've seen in 2026, and Eric and Chris, I imagine you've probably seen the same, is banks now don't only just care about the amount of capital that you have as a buyer approaching a deal, but they also care a lot about your experience too. So there have been numerous people I've spoken with where they're coming from consulting, private equity, investment banking, and they have a fairly good amount of capital, but they want to buy a trades company or something that's kind of blue collar nature. And so then the question is, how do you integrate your experience into the org chart and get the lender comfortable that you're ultimately going to know how to run this business successfully as a buyer? Because even though the SBA backs 75% typically the loan, the bank is still taking on the risk, and they're underwriting you in conjunction with the business since you're the exogenous variable coming into the mix. And so really studying the org chart on a deal leading up to the LOI to understand where you fit into the equation, and if you're going to actually have the know-how to take over what the seller's been doing, which ultimately is almost always more than they market in the listing, that's going to be a very important factor. So moving on here, kept down to the next slide, we're going to talk about bankability. And so basically, what you as a buyer should really be focused on evaluating in a deal before shipping off an LOI. And so I'm going to talk about specifically in the SBA side and different things that the banks want to see in the present time. So one of the first things is debt service coverage. So basically doing a quick check with an Excel model. If you're not an Excel model person, you know, now we have these different AI tools like ChatGPT and Claude that can do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. And essentially looking at what is the debt service of the business that you're looking to ship off an LOI on based on the historical financials of the company with the proposed financing structure that you're looking to take on. So essentially looking at adjusted EBITDA as a numerator divided by pro forma or proposed debt service, so both the annual SBA loan payments along with the seller note payments, and seeing what those numbers are. Most banks typically in the current day and age do not want anything less than 1.25, which is still so low. 1.15 is the bare minimum to scrape by. A couple of years ago, if we're having this webinar, 2024, 2023, there were lots of banks that were still funding acquisitions, even up to $4 or $5 million at the 1.15 DSCR range. As crazy and foreign as that might sound to anyone on this call, Chris and Eric included. But as defaults have happened in the space, banks have tightened up. And so they look at that basically, or most banks typically want to see that as the minimum. And then as you would suspect, the higher the debt service coverage ratio, all else equal, the better interest rate, better credit terms you're ultimately going to get. It looks like I'm just going to try to hit on the questions towards the end, just since we have a lot of slides and campground to cover here. The next thing is looking at your fit as a buyer in conjunction with the industry. So looking at things that during the 2008, 2009, 2010 era, when we had the last big economic downturn, what kind of stood the test of time and what did not. So banks are not too keen on, or most banks are not too keen on hospitality, restaurants, hotels. Some do lots of hotels. It's more rare than common. And so even if you have a really strong deal in specific industries, some banks just simply will not touch it. Now, other things like looking at, is the company that you're buying, is it project-based revenue or is it recurring revenue? So if you're buying a pest control business that has contractually recurring revenue, or a property management company, the bank is typically going to flex more on debt service coverage relative to a project-based revenue company, because you're effectively buying the backlog of the business and your ability and the sales team's ability to sell new revenue. The bank is also going to look at what type of management experience you have pre-acquisition and how that integrates and translates into the company that you're looking to buy. And so things like having led a P&L statement, having managed a team, can you prove that you've had a direct financial outcome on a specific situation from people that you've led and or managed? And if it's blue collar, if you're buying an HVAC business, a plumbing business, a landscaping business, that's better compared to if you're working in a cubicle. No offense to anyone that's worked at a cubicle. I think most people here have, or Eric and Chris have, and probably other folks here too. Banks are also going to look at your post-close liquidity along with your credit score. What we've found to be the case is on the post-close liquidity situation, it's all across the board with what banks want to see. Some banks on the most conservative side of the spectrum want to see 10% of the loan amount as post-close liquidity between borrower or guarantor cash, along with cash on the balance sheet day one. Some don't even want to see that cash that's being counted as the post-close liquidity is coming from SBA loan proceeds. They want to see that you're getting it from the seller. And so that's the most conservative side of the fairway. Some banks might just want to see several months of personal expenses if you're getting adequate working capital from the seller along with from the SBA loan. So flipping here to talking about the seller side of the deal, one important dynamic is to understand what are your seller's goals and motivations after you buy the business. Is this someone that wants a quick exit where they're pushing a lot to not have a seller's note? They basically just want to kind of wipe their hands and be done and hand the baton off to you. In that circumstance, you need to be really careful that one, you have the wherewithal to run the company based on transferable experience, and or there's number two, lieutenant type person in the business that can really kind of be your river guide or Sherpa with learning the industry while you learn the business. And that even very much can be a dangerous circumstance to get into, especially if the company hinges a lot on key client relationships or project-based revenue. And so what I've seen happen before, not just with my clients, but in general, is you kind of have two avatars of sellers. One are helpful sellers where, you're paying them a consulting arrangement and or they have a seller's note and they're economically incentivized for the transition to go well, and things ultimately go well, they're involved and they do as they're supposed to do. There are also sellers that just peace out shortly after closing. And there are stories about that too. And so really gauging that from the broker pre-LOI and what the seller's goals are is going to help you align what your expectations are for, one, how do you structure things like seller financing? Two, how do you financially motivate them for a good transition? And then three, thinking about if it's someone where maybe they're the qualifier for a business license and they want to keep working the business for a couple of years after closing, under the SBA's purview, if they keep some equity and they're willing to sign a 2-year personal guarantee, which can be a challenge to ask for, they can keep staying on in the business for however long you want post-acquisition. So the next thing here is on deal structure and thinking about stock purchases versus asset deals and working capital targets along with down payment and seller financing. So this is when having a good attorney like an Eric and or similar really comes into the mix. I can't give legal advice for better or for worse. Basically, based on the type of company you're buying, there are pros and cons to both. Same thing on the tax side too. With working capital, if you're buying a company where the revenue comes to the business a duration of time after the sale consummates, you're going to want to make sure the balance sheet's capitalized well. And then on the down payment side, you're really going to want to be thinking about where the down payment funds going to come from for the acquisition. Are they going to be coming from yourself? Or are you going to be bringing in equity investors? If you're going to be bringing investors, who are those people going to be? What type of economic terms are you as a sponsor going to be getting? Do you know what you're going to do for the equity step up? Do you know what the pref rate's going to be? Under the current SBA guidelines as of June 1st of last year, you can pay investors, but you can't have mandated payments written into the operating agreement. And so you're going to need to make sure the people that are along for the ride with you understand that, because month 2 after closing, if you don't have the free cash flow to pay investors, and typically people don't, you want people that are patient and along for the ride. Lastly, here on this slide, you want to think about things like if the real estate for the business that you're buying is critically important to operations, or if it's not important. If you're buying a marketing agency or professional services company, take, for example, if you're buying Midwest CPA, and I don't think Chris is for sale as far as I'm aware, the office involved in the transaction is likely not critically important. If you're buying an HVAC business or manufacturing company, there's going to be a lot of importance on that location. And if you disrupt the operation, it's going to compromise your sales. And so the SBA requires that you have a lease where the base term and the options to renew gets you through the term of the loan, which is 10 years if you're buying a business without real estate involved. Lots of the time, what ends up happening is if the real estate is not owned by the seller, the landlord does not have the financial motivation to be helpful during the M&A transaction. And so basically, you want to make sure pre-LOI that you can get confirmation on the duration of the lease that's in place and knowing if it's transferable or assignable, or if you're going to have to pull in the landlord. And if you're going to end up renting and the business is currently owned by the seller, knowing what the fair market rent's going to be that's going to be charged to you so that you can model the financials accurately and use that number from a deal modeling perspective. So next slide here, we're going to talk about, so basically, Eric, I guess this kind of integrates a little bit on the realist or the legal side, maybe kind of sort of too. I don't know if you want to grab one of these.
Sure, I can go into more about what happens when someone jumps on a call with me pre-LOI. So I do offer pre-LOI consulting services, and a lot of these integrate with what Matthias is going to talk or has already talked about and is going to talk about, and what Chris talks about, because this is all really a holistic picture. There's a lot of overlap between things that I see on the legal side and then what lenders care about, and then what I would recommend people go talk to someone like Chris about. We've talked a number of times about networking capital, and I agree with what both of you have said, that is the number one deal killer. That's an expensive deal killer. I've had more than one deal die $40,000 into diligence when buyer and seller are $400,000 apart on networking capital needs. And so I'm happy to talk about what folks should come to my pre-LOI advisory session with, or if you want to jump into what you guys do.
Yeah, I'll chat a little bit more on in the first box here on the left. So basically at Pioneer, one thing we'll do is we will do what's called deal reviews. So basically, up until the point you as the buyer have a signed LOI, we do not require you to have engagement letter or exclusivity. That only comes at the point in time when you have the signed LOI in hand. So when you're looking to basically ship off an LOI in a deal and take an at-bat on a potential deal, you would reach out to myself or a member of our sales team. We would sign an NDA if you'd want us to. We're happy to review materials without one, whatever you as the prospective client prefer. And basically, we would run the contemplated deal structure that you're planning to submit through an Excel financial model to figure out, is the deal structure that you're planning to submit one that's ultimately going to be bankable? Are there going to be concerns on things like licensing, working capital, your personal liquidity as it relates to the specific deal size? Are there going to be concerns on things like experience? So if you're 28 years old, coming off of Wall Street or working at Bain in Chicago or whatever, and you want to go buy a landscaper in Florida for $4 million, how are we going to pitch that to a bank? And there are ways to get things done like that, but you have to have a specific game plan involved there. Then depending specifically on our conviction level, if we feel strongly that we're going to be able to find lending for the deal, or if we're going to be fishing in a small pond, what we'll often do is we'll pre-flight the deal by one or two lenders that we think it might be of interest to gauge kind of appetite for lending on this specific transaction, with the goal basically being knowing that you'd have at least one potential home that could finance a deal should you go under LOI. So pivoting here to the next slide. So this is just talking about debt service coverage and how most of the lending market, not all, but most currently look at it. So most banks are looking at adjusted EBITDA divided by proposed debt service coverage. One thing to mention is different banks have different opinions on add backs. So if you're buying a very add back intensive company, and shameless pitch for Chris and his awesome team at Midwest CPA, this is where they could come into the picture. If there's a lot of add backs involved in a deal, inevitably you're going to need to get a quality of earnings report. Some banks arbitrarily will say, if there's more than X number of add backs, you have to pick the specific ones you want us to roll with. Even if you're getting a QOV, we're just not going to give credit to the seller for these, with their thought process being that the SB and the IRS are essentially sister agencies, and they supposedly share information between each other, and the bank looks at it as a risk to them to finance a very add-back intensive deal. Most banks that we work with, if the add-backs are within reason, and or if you're getting some sort of quality of earnings report or similar, they're going to allow those to be counted. But that's, generally speaking, the more add-back intensive the deal is, even if you're getting a QV, that's going to have a bearing on the interest rate that you're going to get from the bank. Other things that are important to think about are working capital needs post-closing. And so thinking about permanent working capital versus revolving working capital. Permanent working capital is cash that you're getting to the balance sheet that you're going to have in the business at the time that you buy it. That's either coming from the seller and or from the SBA loan. And then there are different things like accounts receivable and accounts payable, and what accounts receivable you may ultimately get as part of the purchase. And so based on the working capital needs of the business, that's going to impact how the bank is going to look at your post-closing liquidity for what they want to see from you as the buyer, and also what they want to see for the bank too. And so basically the long and short of this slide is we're going to give you our honest and candid feedback on if we think we're going to have luck with the deal, because we don't want to waste your time. Other things here, I would say kind of pre-LOI, when you're talking with a seller, generally speaking, you don't want to go too much into specifics as to, one, like what the maximum price is that you're going to pay for a business, especially if you know that you're in a competitive auction scenario, because then you might ultimately get into a bidding war, and it just works against you. So you want to kind of keep those cards close to the chest. You don't necessarily, depending on, what person you're talking with that you're getting advice from, especially if it's another searcher, you don't want to give away the business name or the seller's name, because you don't want someone else bidding on your specific transaction. Other important things too is you want to try to, unless you're talking to like a bank or one of us, you want to be very careful about sharing the seller's personal identifiable information just from a legal kind of safeguarding perspective, in case that ultimately comes back and is an issue for you. And then other things to kind of think about here as far as getting a directional read from us is knowing what your contemplated plan is, as far as if you're going to buy the real estate with the business, or if you're going to lease the real estate, because that will ultimately impact things like amortization, debt service coverage, and then normalizing the rent for the acquisition.
Matthias, can I hit on one thing in that last slide real quick? We're in a day and age of AI, and I think any buyer who doesn't use it is losing out on very valuable technology. At the same time, you make a very good point on not oversharing with people, but also very importantly, not oversharing with AI. So sometimes I talk to people who will just dump everything they get from a sell team that's under NDA into their favorite LLM. If it's a free tier of the LLM, you just violated the NDA, because you just gave it to the LLM and allowed it to train itself on it with no privacy guarantee whatsoever. If it's a paid tier, it's a little more of a gray area and a little better. But I just want to caution folks that be really careful about using LLMs to review matters that are provided, or materials that are provided to you under NDA, because it could be violating the NDA if you don't do it right.
Yeah, good call, Eric. Yeah, those LMs, they're gonna get us. All right, I'll let you take over here.
All right, thanks, Matthias. Okay, so again, going back to what I said earlier, most legal disasters that I see, and I don't see a ton of legal disasters. I like to tell people that when I do legal diligence, most things that we see are fixable. Um, but occasionally there are things that aren't, and I call those legal disasters or legal landmines. And a lot of those just cause the deal to just slowly have the wheels fall off, or the lender to say, sorry, initially we gave you a term sheet, but we're no longer going to lend on this. Most of the time, if we had asked the right questions pre-LOI, then we would know the answers, and we'd know either A, to address them in the LOI and in early negotiations, or to just walk away. Because again, walking away is the cheapest decision you'll make, because I've worked with plenty of buyers who are in the bad position of being late into the deal, where they've spent, again, $30,000 to $50,000 on legal and diligence fees, and they're left with the sunk cost situation where they feel like they're far enough into the deal that they don't want to walk away, or they could walk away, or they could go through with the deal, close on a deal they never should have bought. So let's talk about some of the early questions you can ask, early checks you can run, and then early things you can consider prior to the LOI. So when I work with someone pre-LOI, I do what I call crash test. This is a relatively new framework that I've started working on right now, and I use it because after doing a lot of deals, I just have seen what kills deals, and I'm trying to take that intel earlier to help buyers be smart prior to working on an LOI, prior to submitting an LOI, prior to really wasting time and money on a deal that they shouldn't be wasting their time and money on. Some of these you're going to get questions, or so you're going to get answers to. Some of these, they might just say, give us an LOI, and then we'll give you the answers. Again, going back to my earlier point, do not be the one that takes information that I've shared here and puts together 26 questions and ships it off to the broker before you've even talked to the seller, before you've sold yourself as a credible buyer, because that's one of those things that really turns off the broker, turns off the sell team. So A, make it clear that you're a serious buyer. Get to have an opportunity to start asking questions because they've taken you seriously. And then this is when you want to start talking to the seller and asking questions. I'm not going to go over all of these, but a few of the ones that jump out a lot and can be a real important signal prior to LOI. I'll get, for example, licensing and RMO requirements. Trades were really hot in the last couple of years. I haven't seen a trade deal in a while now. I think a lot of them are being bought up by private equity groups. But one thing I have seen a lot of that still does require licensing are home non-medical services. So home services to help elderly folks, nursing, quasi-nursing services. So understanding what the licensing requirements are is something that you absolutely need to be doing prior to putting together an LOI, prior to really engaging the seller in serious discussions about buying their business. This is something you can do pretty easily. A lot of times you can do your own research, or if you talk to a lawyer pre-LOI, they can assist you in doing that. But knowing what's required helps you in a couple of different ways. Number one, Matthias already talked about what a lender is going to want to see. They're going to want to see that you've got a definitive plan for making sure that you can continue to operate that business, whether it's you being licensed or you having someone who is a long-standing employee is going to hold the license. The last thing you want is for the license to be held by the seller, and they're going to take off, and you've got no way to fill that gap. But number two, even when all that's covered, you also need to.
One comment to add into Eric, sorry to interrupt, is
no problem.
Back to the comment Eric mentioned here on being careful not to ask too many questions to the sell side, because you don't want to, when you're in a competitive process, you don't want to ask more than you have to initially. With some of these things like the business licensing too, you can ask Claude or similar if it can investigate what the license requirements are. Now, these are obviously things you have to validate, but you can do a bit of that lifting yourself pre-LOI to help with reducing the list of questions to ask. Eric, back to you. Sorry for interrupting.
Yeah, absolutely. Matthias brings up a great point, and that's how I usually recommend proceeding. And I'd recommend saying, okay, Claude, and then give me citations so I can go look for myself. So do some of the work, but show me where you got the answers, because even to this day, LLMs do hallucinate, and sometimes they make expensive mistakes for you. But the other question I would ask it then is, how long is the typical licensing transfer or approval process? Because as I mentioned earlier, speed and ability to close is so key right now. Matthias just hit the nail on the head when he talked about the competitive nature of the ETA field right now. More and more, you're going to be competing with other cash buyers who can move fast. So even if a seller likes you and wants to work with you, and believe it or not, that can be the key factor that makes or breaks you as a buyer, is whether the seller likes you. They want to know how long that process takes. And quick horror story on licensing. At a deal last year that took way too long for licensing, and even though both parties were getting along just fine, because of the state agency taking a long time and us not knowing ahead of time how long that state agency would take, the deal dragged into 11th, 12th, 13th innings, and it eventually died. And I think a big part of the reason was because the state agency's taking too long. And so if that was something that you knew ahead of time and were able to do the research, and more of that information is easily available through LLMs, we can set the right time expectations and say, for example, in California, for a home care business that's being purchased and the license being transferred, it's going to take 100+ days. We can set that expectation early. Another one I want to talk about is customer concentration. That's for any sort of recurring revenue business. That's key. And I've seen seller teams be willing to provide anonymized information on that. And that gives you information on whether you're hitting some, I throw out the 25% plus threshold as being like a real, like, hey, this is a red flag. But even below that, if you're risk averse, you might want to start thinking about, okay, do I want to walk from this because it's too customer concentrated? Or another key tool that we use frequently, if there's too much customer concentration, is a forgivable seller note. So you can say, fine, there's such a huge amount of customer concentration, and put this in your LOI that we need some amount of the seller note to be forgivable, and or we need a larger seller note.
One
Another
comment
key
too as well, Eric, to
Mhm.
interject back to the thing with the licensing transfer or whatever, is if you know the time frame for something, like it's going to take 80 days or 100 days, you want your exclusivity to coincide with that, because you don't want to be 30 or 45 days into the process that you know is going to take 100 days, and all of a sudden the broker has a gun to your head and says, hey, exclusivity is up, like, show us good faith efforts that you're further advanced in the financing process, or we're going to go with someone else.
Absolutely. Exclusivity is key here. And I've seen a lot of sellers pushing for unrealistic things like 30 days or 60 days. I don't know if you've seen it, Matthias or Chris, but that's frequently being floated. And, sometimes it's a matter of optics. And sometimes we've just said, okay, fine, let's do 45 days or 60 days. However, it automatically renews. And one thing that we'll do sometimes, if it's a licensing, potential licensing delay deal, is we'll say that if it's pending licensing approval, exclusivity will keep renewing until the licensing approval is either provided or affirmatively declined. So great point on that.
Back to the financing side, you can have a provision that says at the point you give the seller or sell side the commitment letter showing approval, you get extended exclusivity. I've seen that too sometimes.
Exactly. I've done that exact same thing. Because the point is, sellers are more and more antsy that they're going to get stuck in a exclusivity with a buyer who can't close while all their friends are getting their businesses sold to deep pocket private equity. So that's their biggest fear, and we've got to understand that if you want to be competitive. I'll hit on one more here because it frequently comes up, and it's a pretty big deal killer. And it's employee and independent contractor classification. This is one of those questions I always recommend buyers ask. So I would always recommend you ask early about their workforce. And the reason being, there's certain types of businesses, one of them being landscaping businesses, but even IT management. So remote IT management services, a lot of times they'll have mostly independent contractors. And the risk there is reclassification. And that's something that you'll want to know about early so you can either review or be ready to jump on that right after LOI, so that it's something that if it's going to kill your deal, it'll kill it super early. The risk is independent contractors that are treated like employees create the risk that after you buy will be converted to employees, either by the IRS or a state like California that's very vigilant on that. And then that could create a significant both tax liability as well as legal liability to you. So those are a few of the key things that we talk about when we run through a crash test. But just to point out, this isn't like one or two things. This is usually a holistic, let's go through all 13, see what the signals tell you. Sometimes there's information that we can't get. And then in that case, I recommend you get it as soon after LOI as possible. That way you know whether you got a good deal or not.
Awesome. Should we go to the next slide, Eric?
Yes, please.
Okay. All right.
So this is, again, the extension of what I'm talking about when I work with someone on a pre-LOI and LOI advisory capacity. And so we're looking for things like customer concentration. We already talked about that. Contracts with no assignability clause. Leases. Matthias hit on that already, so I won't go into the lender perspective on leases, but it's critical for you too. If it's a location-dependent business, and a fair number of the businesses that I've closed on are location-dependent, you've got to usually make a case for the fact that it's not location-dependent, right, Matthias?
Yeah, so typically, so just to jump in and field this one. So if you're buying a business where you have other options in the market that you could rent from, what I kind of going back to LLMs and namely Claude Cowork, what I tell buyers to do is to basically give Claude or your favorite LLM cliff notes on the industry for the business, the market, and like what it does, and have it run an analysis to find like other locations that are similar in the market to show the bank that there's a prevalence of places you could move to. And this is something that you want to get in front of, ideally close to the LOI stage, with the reason being that if you know the lease is not going to go for 10 years, base options plus extensions, you want the credit approval or commitment letter to reference that, because once the bank approves the loan, trying to get anything else approved or changed is just a pain in the ass. Basically, lots of these big banks are built like, manufacturing assembly lines where like once the underwriter is done with the deal, they want to move on to the next one. They don't want to revisit it. So that's something that you want to figure out pre-LOI if possible.
Yeah, and I'm going to talk about leases and landlords a bit more. You mentioned it earlier, Matthias. But the number of deals that I've had that have dragged on into dangerous territory with everybody waiting to close and we're just waiting on a landlord are so many that I usually am now starting to talk to the buyers early about landlords. So pre-LOI, what can you find out about a landlord? You can find out if they're a national corporate landlord, which can sometimes make it harder to work with. They have some big lawyer, sorry, not a big lawyer, but a big law firm that they work with that it might take them a while to get to a lawyer who can review things. Or is it someone that the seller knows well and can connect you with if the deal moves forward pretty quickly? And then if the seller is going to be the landlord, I usually recommend at least putting some amount of expectations in the LOI as to what the terms of the lease are going to be. If you don't put anything in, I just about guarantee you they're going to find a lawyer who's going to put in a very onerous triple net lease that has expenses that you're probably not anticipating. So if the anticipation is some sort of modified gross lease or something more fair to the landlord or sort of more fair to you as a buyer tenant, I usually recommend that be encapsulated in the LOI. Let's talk about the next. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, sorry. One more comment too on this slide before we move on to the next one. So the license is tied to a specific person. If it's a seller, most banks typically aren't going to be comfortable with that, because if you're buying a company where that license needs to ultimately generate revenue, if you think about the dynamics with the deal where you have seller notes, transition services agreements, and things like that, the bank's concern is that if things don't go well post-acquisition, the seller could put that license in jeopardy. And so, what I tell buyers is if you're buying a company where there's any sort of license that's required, you want a game plan going into the LOI process to know who's going to be the qualifier that's not the seller. Can it be a key employee? Does that involve having an employment agreement? That's where someone like Eric would get involved. And basically thinking through how that's going to ultimately work.
Yeah, let me expand
Sorry.
on that. Thank you, Matthias. I usually like to explain with war stories, anonymized, of course, but I've had plenty of deals that have died again after LOI because nobody really thought about the continuity. And that is both a risk for you as the buyer as well as a lender requirement risk. And sometimes buyers have this idea that, hey, I'm going to have the seller stay on for 6 months, and then I'm going to go take the test for the thing, and I'm pretty sure that I can do it, and I've got two chances within that 12-month period. That's a pretty tough, thin margin plan for continuity of business that you've got millions of dollars in loan, personally guaranteed loan payments on the line for. So that's definitely something that I will work with you as a buyer, and put together a plan that can have a plan A, a plan B, and sometimes even a plan C. And as Matthias pointed out, sometimes either plan B or C is going to be the employment agreement with a key employee. And that's something that is a good idea to talk to the seller about. A lot of times they might help. So sometimes we've had bonus plans for key employees so that we keep them around for a couple of years after closing. And if that's something that you want to do, I've had lots of sellers be willing to share in the bonus plan. And so that's a nice piece to talk to the seller about. They can see that you've thought about the continuity of the business. You've thought about helping to keep their key employee happy. And it just keeps the conversation going on keeping the seller's legacy moving forward.
Awesome.
So that's,
Eric, just since we didn't get to Chris, maybe if you'd want to take this slide and the next one, and then we
yep,
can rock it forward so we can get to the Q&A.
sounds good. Yeah. So when I help people with LOIs, or if you're writing your own LOI, definitely feel free to do that with LLMs, as Matthias pointed out, throwing things into Claude Cowork. Pretty good LOIs come out. But I want to point out 5 things that I always recommend you make sure that is in your LOI, whether you work with a lawyer or you draft it yourself. We talked about exclusivity already. I don't want to belabor this, but make sure it's realistic for your deal. Ideally 90. If the seller pushes for something shorter, make it auto renew. Financing contingency absolutely needs to be there, especially if you're putting a earnest money agreement or good faith deposit down. You should not lose your money because the financing falls through. Financing falls through for many reasons. It's not always your fault. The LOI needs to be part binding and part non-binding. This is the number one problem that I see with LOIs that are drafted either by LLMs or buyers themselves. The binding portion needs to be exclusivity. Who handles what costs? Basically, buyer and seller handles each. You each handle your own costs no matter what. So neither party can go to the other to say, "Hey, pay my costs." Deal died. So that's another binding provision, or confidentiality. Everything else should be non-binding. But just as importantly, those things are binding. Because if you say the whole LOI is non-binding, suddenly your exclusivity means nothing. Working capital target. I imagine Chris is going to expand on this. I usually recommend folks on a business that is working capital intensive to work with someone like Chris to get an estimate so that you've got a good ballpark number. Because the last thing you want is to say, yeah, we'll agree on net working capital. Seller's going to provide some. Seller's thinking 200, you think a million. The deal's going to die, and it's just going to die when it's expensive. Finally, especially again, if you're putting money down, there should be absolutely clear binding language, and this needs to be binding on how you're going to get your money back, who's going to hold the money, so you don't lose $50,000 that you didn't intend on losing.
Awesome. So then flipping forward here, I'll let you take this one here too.
Yeah, it's just a quick slide on where I get involved in a deal. So as I mentioned earlier, I do provide lots of pre-LOI services these days. With the market being what it is, I provide pre-LOI advisory to help crash test the deal, to help structure it, and put together the LOI. And more often than not, a lot of times seller teams are redlining LOIs and going back and forth with their markups. And I'm available to help with that too. And if not, I'm always happy to jump in the deal post LOI. And with that, to preserve your legal a budget, I recommend that you work with your lender and you've got a term sheet. So you know someone's willing to lend on the deal, and you work with your financial diligence provider to at least get through the initial proof of cash or somewhat through the diligence process. And they've kind of given you at least a partial green light so you know that the deal is not going to fall apart on the numbers.
Awesome. Appreciate it, Eric. So now, Chris, pivoting to you here. Best or last, financial due diligence.
Yeah. Well, thanks, guys. Yeah, so here we're going to talk a little about financial due diligence and kind of what that process looks like, but then also some of the things that you can do earlier in the process to decrease the likelihood of your deal falling apart. Because I think pretty reliably the QOV is the most likely piece of the puzzle to kill your deal. And we probably worked on over 300 deals since I started the firm. We did 85 last year. About 60% of those deals that we work on average, end up getting to closing, which means that's a little bit better than a coin flip, but there's still a 40% chance that your deal is going to die, which means that there's deal costs involved, and those can get expensive really quick if you're not managing them well. So you want to do whatever is possible earlier, pre-LOI if you can, to try and weed out the deals that don't have a high chance of actually getting to the closing table. You can go to the next slide here, Matthias.
Yep. Sorry.
No, you're good. All right. So what's the point of a QOV? Like, what are we actually trying to answer? And when you think about why someone does a QOV, it really comes back to the fact that what a QOV looks at are the different levers that impact purchase price. So you think about how you calculate purchase price in a deal. There's three main components. There's the enterprise value. So that's the earnings or whatever measure of cash flow you're using, SDE or EBITDA, multiplied by some multiple in order to get to your enterprise value. You have any working capital that's being included in the deal. And then are there any hidden liabilities like debt-like items such as unearned revenue, or maybe there's like warranties that are outstanding that you're taking on that potential liability that you need to be compensated for taking on that piece. And a QV helps you determine each of those inputs. So what's the actual earnings? What's the actual cash flow of this business? That's something you need to understand. We need to validate add backs. So they're doing their accounting wrong. And then you're going to multiply that by some multiple, and what goes into your decision making for what multiple you're going to put on that business, or what are the risk factors at play here? So is there a lot of concentration in this business? Is the revenue very lumpy? Are the margins really tight? What actually drives profits in that company? And a QV can help you determine that. Then you need to know what's the normal level of working capital. If you don't get sufficient working capital when you close on a business, you've essentially paid more for the company, because you now have to bring capital to the business either through debt or through equity in order to keep the wheels on, keep the business running. And so you need to make sure that you understand, if you're not getting the working capital in the deal, that you know that ahead of time, and you know what the amount is that you should have, and that you're prepared for that, because it really is just an increase in purchase price if you're not getting normal working capital in the deal.
Chris, and just super quick on that, because working capital is always a very popular topic. Can you give an example of maybe one or two industries where it's fundamentally important, and if you're a buyer, you should be thinking about it at the pre-LOI stage?
Yeah, any type of business with a lot of project-based revenue is usually going to be a business that has longer cycles. Manufacturing, a lot of times too, usually giving longer terms to their customers, or it takes them longer to get paid. It's going to be on a business by business basis, but in general, those industries seem to have longer conversion cycles. And within certain businesses too, it's going to matter. So like working on some restoration deals recently, and we had one company that was in restoration that was getting paid almost entirely by insurance. Which meant that they had really long terms for how long it took them to get paid, like 90 plus days, while the other one was primarily getting paid directly by the homeowner. So in that case, they had a pretty short conversion cycle. So it's going to depend on the business, but in general, project-based companies and manufacturers are going to have longer cash conversion cycles and therefore require more working capital.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, absolutely. So in order to reduce the possibility of your deal dying in QOV, there are some things that you can do pre-LOI to spot red flags early on. And some of those things are going to be, one, look at the trend in revenue. You're going to get in the sim at the very least some annual financial statements for probably at least 3 years. So you want to see ideally very stable, slow growth of revenue is really a great sign, because if you see 1 year, the year they're valuing the business off of, that is dramatically higher than the other years, it's probably gonna be hard to get the deal financed, and that you might find in diligence that there's a reason that they had that large increase, and that reason isn't a sustainable one, and the business is not going to operate like that normally going forward. So you do want to check that trend. And obviously, if a business is shrinking and the revenue is declining, that's a red flag that you need to really understand and see if that's going to continue in the future. Probably the second biggest deal killer that we run into behind working capital is revenue recognition issues, especially with project-based businesses where they're booking all of the revenue in one period and then the expenses get booked into a different period. And an easy way to spot that pre-LOI is looking for the gross margin behavior at that point. If you see in 1 year they have gross margins of 50%, and then another year they have gross margins of 30%, the business probably didn't change that much in the way their gross margins should be calculated. And it probably indicates that a lot of the expenses are not hitting in the same period as the revenues associated with those expenses. And so there's some issue there with how they're recognizing revenue.
Chris,
Add backs are an obvious issue. If you have add backs as a large percentage of EBITDA, it inherently is just going to add more risk to the deal, because there's more things that the seller's trying to, they spent money on, but they're saying aren't real or recurring expenses. So you need to be able to validate those. And we'll do that in QOV, and they could be legitimate, but anytime you have more add backs as a higher percentage of EBITDA, you're adding more risk. The deal is going to end up dying in QOV. Working capital seasonality. If it's a business where you have working capital that changes a lot in the summer months, and maybe it's a lot higher than it is in the winter months, you need to make sure that you're not just looking at the working capital and having a conversation of working capital only on a trailing 12-month basis without looking at the monthly fluctuations, because it may change the story dramatically. And then finally, if you're only looking at the tax returns, and the tax returns are often on a cash basis, you're not also looking at an accrual basis. Again, going back to some of those revenue recognition issues, or other like accrual to cash differences of how things are amortized over time, you can result in having a very different picture of the financials. We see all the time, like businesses will spend a bunch of money at the end of the year in December in order to reduce their tax bill, but they'll be spending money on things they're going to be using into the new year. So you might look at the year-to-date numbers and the business is looking fantastic, but it's only looking fantastic because the company had kicked a lot of their revenue into the new year and accelerated a lot of their expenses into the previous year.
Chris, can I ask you a question on something whether you've been seeing that I've had come up on deals, and that's revenue recognition for usually these are like software companies where they take subscriptions in 1 year and then they're expecting that the buyer is going to just service it and they're not going to get any of the unrecognized revenue. Is that something that you're going to catch in the QOV process?
Yeah,
is
definitely.
that something you recommend buyers ask questions about early?
Yeah, software is a big one for revenue recognition issues, because oftentimes software companies are trying to get people to pay for 12 months in advance, right? But they haven't necessarily earned that revenue yet because the 12 months haven't come up yet. So yeah, that's something you'd always want to be looking for. And the difficult thing there is, how are you going to handle that unearned revenue? It's going to depend on the business. With a software business, for example, the incremental cost to service that revenue is quite low. So you're probably not going to be able to get the seller to treat all of that unearned revenue as a debt-like item, because the reality is that there's $1 million in unearned revenue. It's not going to cost you anywhere near $1 million to service that revenue. Well, on the other hand, if you're buying a construction business and they have $1 million in unearned revenue and they haven't bought any of the materials yet and they haven't paid for any of the labor yet, well, then you're probably going to need that cash in order to service that revenue. And there's a much greater argument you have to get that money left behind.
Yep, good points. Okay, so flipping to the next slide here, Chris, I'll let you drive this one.
Yeah, so something you want to look at, right? Ad backs are always going to be a thing, and especially this smaller end of the market. And you want to be able to quickly look through a sim and gut check whether what you're being shown for ad backs are legitimate, crazy, or maybe just somewhere in the middle. And these are not hard and fast rules. We got some things in general buckets here of what's going to be legitimate. Owner's compensation, if it's way above market, they've been paying themselves basically 100% of cash flow as salary each year. Maybe they're in a C corp, and they've made the C corp is making 750 grand a year, but they just pay it all out as salary. You're probably going to be able to add back a portion of that to EBITDA if the replacement cost for the CEO is not that high. There are some personal expenses that you can usually easily identify, like maybe their health insurance goes through the business, and you can clearly see on the insurance bill what's for the owner and what's not. The costs with selling the business, they're probably going to have fees for professionals. All those are going to be ones that are pretty easily identifiable and pretty easy to substantiate and add back. Then there's going to be ones that are a little bit more difficult or a little more bogus on the scale. And some of them might be like, maybe they've recently adjusted terms with a vendor, or they've switched vendors, and they used to have an IT provider that cost them $1,000 a month. They have a new one that costs them $500 a month. And they might try and show the financials with that lower run rate of those expenses going forward. And that's going to be a bit harder to substantiate. The story is going to need to be ironclad, and you're going to have to really prove that the story checks out. And the longer that's been going on for, the easier it's going to be to prove. If they just did it last month, it's probably something you're going to have to toss out. All those sorts of
because the question there, just to kind of have a little bit of a collaborative dialogue here, is how do you bifurcate and prove that IT spend didn't help realize that revenue or the sales, right? And
exactly. And
because the two are intertwined at the hip.
Yeah, exactly. That's one that we run into a lot, where we see marketing spend get added back. That's one that we're almost always going to toss out, because it's very difficult to prove that marketing spend had zero impact on their revenue in the historical period, right? If even if they said it was a failed campaign, the other thing there is that failed marketing campaigns are a part of business, right? I've spent a lot of money on marketing that went nowhere.
I've spent a lot of money.
And I spent a lot of money on marketing that's done really, really well, right? Sometimes you just don't know, and it's just part of being a business owner that sometimes you spend money on things that don't work out. Similar with bad hires. I see people trying to add back bad hires sometimes. Again, every once in a while, it'll be one where there's some way to substantiate it, where they really had duplicate people and someone wasn't needed. But in the vast majority of cases, if they're trying to add back someone that just wasn't a good fit, we're going to argue that's a normal part of business. Making bad hires that don't work out, that you have to let go, is just part of doing business.
Awesome. All right, so next slide here. Let's find my mouse. So back to you again here, Chris.
So working capital, just double click on this. Pre-LOI, you want to try and get the best figure you possibly can. But the reality is that you're probably not going to have enough information pre-LOI to nail the working capital figure. So what I recommend to buyers, what you should do is, first, you should define it well in your LOI, how you're going to handle working capital. Is it going to be included? And if it is going to be included, how are you going to define that peg over what period of time? Make sure that's listed, that it's going to be subject to doing diligence. But you probably don't want to marry yourself to a particular figure, because you probably don't have enough information to nail the figure at that point. That being said, I still think you should have a conversation with the seller around ballpark where the two of you are coming from. Because you don't want to find out when you're thousands of dollars into diligence that the seller was thinking you only need 50K to run the business because that's what he keeps in his bank account. Meanwhile, he maintains an accounts receivable balance of $800,000. Right. And so you at least want to know that you're in the same ballpark of the seller, but you don't want to pigeonhole yourself into a number when it's definitely subject to change once we get more information in the diligence process. Some things you definitely want to be looking out for are seasonality, like we talked about earlier. If it's a business that's super seasonal, you might have an average throughout the year of $400,000, but the high point of the year is $800,000 and the low point is $150,000. So if you close the business and you only have 400 grand and no line of credit and no additional cash in your balance sheet, you're going to go bust when you get to those busy cycles in the year. So you need to be ready for that. And you may even adjust your peg for that seasonality by more heavily weighting the months where the business is more active and giving less weight to the months where the business is not as active.
Awesome.
I guess the final note here is pre-LOI, what you can do to try and estimate this figure. And we have a rough calculator on our website that you can use to test this out, is try and calculate the conversion cycle. Figure out what is the gap between when money leaves the door of the business and when it comes back in, and use those numbers of days to back into, all right, how much in operating expenses do I need to keep the business running during that period of time? And that can get you a pretty good estimate pre-LOI, so you can at least go into LOI with a good ballpark figure.
Awesome. Thanks for all that, Chris. So I think this is the last slide for you.
Yeah. So when you're working through the QOV, some of the things you want to be thinking about is, one, am I scoping this deal properly for the QOV? So some things that we'll always do is, one, we're going to phase our analysis. So you want to make sure that you're not on the hook for an entire diligence engagement at the outset, because if we catch something super early when we're doing the proof of cash, for example, we want to let you know right then and there, kill the deal, save everyone time so that you can get onto the next deal and reduce potential dead deal costs. You also want to scope your project to the right size of deal. When some of the difficult parts about picking a QOV provider is that QOV is not a defined term, right? It's like an audit has the AICPA that defines, here is what an audit is, here's what you have to do in order to complete an audit. Even a tax return, right? There's instructions on every tax form that says, here are the steps that have to be completed in order to complete this tax form. QOV is a consulting engagement. Technically, anyone can do one, anyone can engage on one. So you really want to make sure that when you're talking to providers, you're figuring out what scope is being included, and does the scope that you're utilizing fit the deal size that you're working on? Because you can go and you can bring your $4 million HVAC deal to different QOV providers. You can get a quote for $5,000, and you can literally also get a quote for $50,000 just because you took it to different firms with different scopes. So really make sure you understand the scope that you're using. Some things that you'll want to check for are, one, just kind of recap, right? Are the add backs a large percentage of revenue? Are there some qualitative risks where concentration is really high? Are the tax returns on cash basis and the books on accrual basis, which is making them way off? Lots of seasonality and working capital. Having the lender check the deal even before you go to a provider, like try and get a term sheet, I think is a good practice, and reduces the chances of you racking up dead deal costs. And then, in general, larger deals over $1 million is where we're seeing more people do QOVs. On deals under $1 million, it's not unreasonable to get one done. Just make sure that you're scoping it properly, your provider's scoping it properly, the deal you're working on.
Awesome. Appreciate it, Chris. So, so kind of recap here, what each of us covered, and for everyone that registered for this webinar, we're gonna send. I think Raphael and my team will likely send both the deck along just with a guide of things to look for pre-LOI deals, So I covered debt service coverage, get back of the envelope, how to think about deals from what banks want to see, buyer fit, industry, Kev, what you bring to the equation, and then thinking about when you're buying a business, the impact of real estate being included on the amortization versus if you're buying a business with a lease location, how you have to think about things like pro forma rent and trying to understand what that's going to be if the seller historically hasn't paid rent. Eric covered Kev all things legal, and then Chris all things financial due diligence. So just to kind of skip ahead here in the interest of time, in this slide deck, which is going to be sent, is going to have each person's contact information on it. We're all on LinkedIn, reachable via email, as well as Twitter, now X for anyone that's on there. So we're going to jump and kind of fast forward here to Q&A. So anyone that has questions here on this call, happy to answer any of them. So questions for me, Chris, and or Eric, and if there are any that we're not sure on or that you don't want to ask here, feel free to shoot them via email as well. But yeah, anyone with questions?
We might not have any, but
Yeah, we can wait a few minutes here. Chris proudly has his company swag both on his wall and his banner behind him.
that's right. You got to rep.
Okay, here's a question, Eric. This might be best for you from Michael Hutchinson. Acquiring entity choice. We're currently an S corp. Can we make deals?
Yes, that's going to be a deal specific decision as to whether I mean, it's going to be up to tax advice, really. You're most of the time, are you actually S corp or an LLC? LLCs can be taxed as S corps. Corporations can be taxed as S corps or C corps. This is a little bit more of a tax question, but most of the time I recommend folks just form an LLC. We'll do the entity selection, or sorry, the entity formation. We'll do all the paperwork, and then we usually recommend that you ship it off to your CPA or tax advisor to determine whether you want to do an election to be taxed as anything other than default. So I don't advise on the tax election, but entities choice wise, almost always an LLC.
There's attorney Josh Lowenthal who's phenomenal. He does tax legal and he could have help out there too. Eric, there's another question. I think Chris is typing a response from Sophia Khan. What may one expect from a cost perspective for these services? So Sophia, Pioneer is no cost to you because we get paid by the bank after closing a referral fee. Chris and Eric, I'll let you answer what that might look like if you'd want to on this call.
Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, so I put in there a link to our pricing page. It depends on the deal. Size of the deal matters, how the entities are structured matters, the industry matters because it can determine how complex their accounting is. So it's kind of hard to give just a one number. Say most of our SBA size deals land somewhere between 10 and 20K. That's a pretty wide range, but it really is going to be deal dependent. And then larger deals that get more complicated can be more than that, and there are some that are simpler that can get below it. So.
And for my pre-LOI advisory service, just charge a flat fee of $750. That's completely separate from the buy-side engagement fee. I've structured it that way just because, as you imagine, a lot of deals don't get past LOI. So I want to be able to provide maximum value by completely decoupling that from buy-side advisory or buy-side representation services. So that includes running through the deal, structuring it, drafting the LOI, and anything to do with back and forth with the sell side on comments.
Eric, I'll let you take this next one here from Josh. Sorry, Joe, not Josh. So Joe asked, should I wait to reach out to create my deal team only once I have a deal that I'm thinking about going to submit an LOI for, Or is it better to get a team in place up front, especially since speed seems to matter so much these days?
I 100% recommend that folks book meetings early so they at least get warmed up in terms of who's out there, who they're likely to call upon when a deal is ready and hot and heavy, because as you point out, deal speed is absolutely important. As at the same time, good advisors are busy. So if you've got a deal and you can reach out and say to someone, hey, you and I had a call 3 weeks ago, 3 months ago, I'm back on your radar, I'd like to engage you. You're more likely to get a response than if it's like hey, can I get on a an initial meet and greet call? I've got a deal that's already live. So I absolutely recommend reaching out to folks to see who you might want to engage on your deal team as early as possible.
Yeah, same comment there. I'll take this next one. Okay, so question from anonymous attendee. Can you clarify when the process you should first reach out to discuss SBA financing options? Is that a conversation that should start before you reach out to brokers or sellers, or wait until you're under NDA, or is that an ideal timing? So, anonymous attendee, the way I'd answer that is I would say as early as possible. We will do what's called a financial letter of support. So if you as a buyer have good management, P&L experience, you've led team managed people, you have at least a 6A credit score, and you're willing to provide a complete personal financial statement, redacting your social and also the bank statements or brokerage statements, redacting account numbers that shows you have at least 6 figures liquid, we'll put together what's called a financial letter of support to basically say Pioneer Capital Advisory has vetted you as a buyer. If you find a deal that fits your background, we feel pretty good that we could find a bank subject to going through the SBA underwriting approval process. I would say knowing that you're at least bankable as a buyer, pre-LOI is useful. But the kind of part two of this is like, unlike when you're buying a house or property and you get like a conditional commitment from a mortgage lender, it hinges on the deal itself too. So we like to talk to people pre-LOI to kind of make sure that the deal they're working on ultimately matches their background. Because we've had people that we've done those letters for before where they're shipping off LOIs on businesses that don't necessarily meet their background. And then we have to have the conversation on things like, how are you going to qualify for the license if it's HVAC or whatever? So the more vetting we can do on the front end, the higher conviction we have, knowing that we can find banking for it. Eric, question here for you. So Eric mentioned putting an employment agreement in place or a bonus or key employee that's a license holder, plus they would have a PG on the SBA loan. In situations where the license is a GC license, it takes up to 2 years to get eligible. That's a large risk. How do you navigate this, or do you run away?
Just to clarify that, no one has to do the PG on the SBA loan unless it's the seller themselves that is sticking around and retaining equity. So my structure of having an employment agreement in place or a bonus to keep the key employee there would be without that PG. And you can do a number of things here to keep an employee satisfied and sticking around. But one of the key things that I think is, you should hit at the LOI stage is that you want to be able to meet with and vet this employee prior to close, because you can have the best structure in place, but if the employee is someone that you can't get along with, or you find out they were going to be the one that was supposed to buy the business and now they're disgruntled, you could lose this employee in day one. So there are a number of ways to keep them around. Bonus plans, equity is tricky. It can be done, but it's tricky. So usually we go with things like bonus plans or phantom equity, which is a contractual obligation, or some sort of a contract that gives them a better employment, and then maybe they're no longer employed at will, and you can only terminate them for certain reasons. So that give them a lot more comfort in being employed there. So I've had a lot of deals be done on this basis. Whether you look at this and think that's too thin of an ice to skate on, or not, and you run away, that's kind of a risk assessment that you need to take.
Yeah, and I'd say candidly, like on these trades companies, it's tougher because it's like there's a lot of, like it depends on the state, and like different banks have different ways of thinking about it. So some banks, they will not do the transaction or do the deal if there's not an equity holder that's a qualifier. Others are fine if you have like an employment agreement, a key employee. And so like we like on our end from Pioneer, we kind of know what different banks have the different requirements. So we have a big Excel spreadsheet of like this is what Huntington wants to see versus whomever. And so based on what you're trying to do, we can say like, hey, there's only 3 banks that would do the deal this way. And then you can make an educated decision yourself as a buyer on if it makes sense.
Matthias, I'll also point out that another way to proceed there is to look for what's licensed businesses that require very little licensing. For example, general contractor businesses in the state of Washington require someone to just post a bond, take a test, and just about anybody can do that. But it also creates enough of a trades moat that it's still attractive. So that's another way to approach that.
Yeah. Yeah. So next question here. Okay, so how do you pencil a deal when there's interest rate risk fluctuations? The DSCR might look okay now, but if there is a rate change in the future, how do lenders look for that buffer? What I would say candidly there is like a couple of years ago, before we got to peak interest rates, more banks were looking at shocks, whereas now more of the lenders that like we work with, I think there's kind of a perspective that we're at peak prime. And so there isn't really a shock that's being modeled into these deals, at least currently now, albeit like not to kind of get too philosophical here with the whole inflationary environment that we're in, the new Fed chair, what's going to happen with rising costs, curbing inflation versus unemployment. It's hard to say what's ultimately going to happen there. I would say like on your end as a buyer, and not as a attendee, if you want to kind of curb things and buffer, feel more than welcome to. What I typically say is like if you're modeling it 9.5 is the interest rate because that's 275 over prime, which is the peak interest rate, unless you're doing a deal with a non-bank SBA lender, in which case it could be prime plus 3 because their cost of funds is higher. You're generally in a safe spot. So that's what I would say there. Question from Sophia, who has experience working in California? I've done some deals there. Chris and Eric, I'll let you guys answer.
Yeah, I think we've done quite a few in California.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy to chat with you. Can't really comment on jurisdictional things publicly.
Yep. Agreed. So get reaction to deal situation. Revenue's been declining 5 to 10% each of the past 4 years. EBITDA is 6 to 10% gross. Proposed add-backs are 3 times EBITDA. My answer there is I would run for the hills. Honestly, I would not. I would not do that transaction. Chris, what are your thoughts?
Declining in EBITDA is very slim, huh? And proposed add backs are 3 times EBITDA. That's what it is. Yeah, I mean, there's lots of flags there, and you'd have to look at deal by deal, but yeah, it's not looking good off the rip. So
yeah, I probably run for the hills on that one. I mean, the last candidly speaking, there you might only get to do one deal if you go belly up, and sometimes you have to kiss a lot of frogs before you find the prince. In this case, I would just pass on that. Rodriguez says, thanks, Chris. Is there a rule of thumb for how to account for aging equipment in the purchase price?
Yeah, so I think this is in response to his original question was for CapEx intensive businesses, is there if there's aging equipment, how do you factor future CapEx in the purchase price or deal terms? Do you bring back depreciation as an expense or adjust it for potential maintenance expenses? The answer, unfortunately, is it depends, right? I have seen it treated like there was a business I was working on where there was a pretty large fleet of trucks, and that fleet of trucks was very old. Like there was a high percentage of the fleet was like close to $200,000. I mean, excuse me, 200,000 miles or over 200,000 miles. And it was, there was trucks that weren't being used but needed to be, and it was a bit of a mess. And the buyer was able to treat the equipment that wasn't usable as debt-like, and basically reduce purchase price that they would have paid for the business that was the fleet up to snuff by the amount that it would cost to get the fleet back up to where it should be, because the seller had basically just stopped reinvesting in the fleet when they first decided they wanted to sell the business. And it took them like 2 years, and like no money had been spent to keep the fleet up to date.
Yeah, CapEx bombs are a pain in the ass. I mean, I've seen it happen before. Like there was not one of my deals, but there was someone from like the S and Bash thing that was talking about like a landscaping business he bought, and like some of the vehicles were just unusable. And it's like unless you have a seller's note, some money parked in escrow or like a financial motivation, you're straight up screwed, honestly.
Yeah. And the other piece there is that even if the equipment is up to snuff, but you have regular maintenance, like you need to be accounting for that in your debt service coverage, because that is a real expense you need to spend every year to keep the business in operation.
And I should point out that's a good reason for your financial diligence provider. If they spot something like that, where it's like, okay, we need this type of maintenance to be done, or this is in that equipment is in disrepair, for them to coordinate with your deal lawyer, because that's something that might need to be addressed in your reps and warranties.
Mm-hmm.
So Dimitri asks, any experience lending on new franchise builds, wants to build a Culver's in his area. So Dimitri, the first bank I worked for out of college, which coincidentally was called First Bank Financial Center, since renamed to Bank 59 because the name was too damn long. The guy or one of the lenders I worked with did like a ton of Culver's transactions. I both eat at Culver's sometimes against my better judgment, but I've also worked on Culver's deals before. The biggest thing I would say there is, from what I recall, they're conservative as to like the avatar from a financial profile that they want the sponsor to have. And then you also have to work, like up until the point you have several locations when you can get a GM, you have to be boots on the ground, like in the storefront. And so a lot of people that are doing these ETA deals and having this domain, they want to not just buy one business, but do multiple. And so the question is, do you want to be an owner operator or like have more focus on doing growth? But yes, I've worked on those and would love to chat. I think so we answered Rodrigo. I think we've kind of covered a lot of ground here. So thanks everyone that joined. We will send some materials out post webinar. And if anyone has questions, the emails for each of us will be in that slide deck. So thanks everyone that joined here. I hope.
Thanks everybody.
Thanks everyone.